This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Anand-Samy, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardoj, an economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit and the Adriatic Institute for Public Policy. We extend a special warm welcome to our special guest on America's Roundtable this weekend, Dr. Marc Miles. Marc Miles has researched and written about global markets for more than 30 years, and prior to becoming a global strategy consultant, founding Global Economic Solutions in Boston, he was the director of the Center for International Trade and Economics of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and editor of the annual Heritage Foundation Wall Street Journal Index of Economic Freedom. In that capacity, he traveled widely throughout the United States, Eastern and Western Europe, South and Central America, and Hong Kong, working with government officials, business people, think tanks, and students. Dr. Miles began his career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, followed by a research and teaching career as a tenured professor at Rutgers University. During that time, he wrote numerous scholarly articles and 3 books, including International Economics in an Integrated World, with author B. Laffer, and Beyond Monetarism, Finding the Road to Stable Money. And after leaving the academic world, he was an advisor to institutional investors at several investment research and forecasting firms, focusing on pending investment trend shifts in both equities and fixed income. Dr. Miles' articles on globalization and our financial and commercial markets have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe. And he holds degrees from the University of Chicago with a bachelor's, master's, PhD, and a Master of Science degree from the London School of Economics. It is a great delight to have you on America's Roundtable, Dr. Miles.
Good morning, Dr. Miles.
Good morning. It's good to talk to you again.
Great. Dr. Miles is joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, and we're all enjoying this beautiful autumn-like weather here. And we would like to begin our discussion, Dr. Miles, on taxes. Dr. Miles has been just an extraordinary speaker and writer and researcher on these issues, and taxes appear to be a major issue in this 2012 presidential election season. Both Democrats and Republicans are attempting to sway voters by talking about taxes and communicating what they would do for voters. And on one side, there is a notion to increase taxes for a select group, and on the other side, a plan to reduce tax rates for the middle class and a strategy to grow the economy. Dr. Miles, you were recently interviewed by PBS, and you were quoted as saying, I quote, "As one who has been an advocate of the Laffer curve since its inception, I appreciate your attempt to be even-handed on the subject. However, your emphasis missed the true Laffer curve message. The curve is not about the direct relationship between tax rates and labor force participation, but simply a relationship between tax rates and tax revenues." And in fact, I would just very much like to hear your views, Dr. Miles, and could you kindly elaborate on your point and on taxes? How high is taxes too high for taxpayers?
Well, the basic point is quite simple. In economics, we talk about, for example, the total revenue curve. Think about the corner store, grocery store, and as it begins to raise prices, it becomes less competitive, and some of its customers go elsewhere. So while prices go up, it's unclear whether or not the total revenue of the store will go up. At some point, customers will simply go to other stores. So the same is true with taxes. As you begin to raise tax rates, the country becomes less competitive, it becomes more expensive to do business there, and people will find alternative places in which to put their money. And certainly we know about corporations who leave their money abroad, or people who move their money offshore. And of course, there's a variety of tax shelters to avoid the high tax rates as well. In terms of how high are taxes, I would say that, the tax rate in the United States is high relative to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. That doesn't seem to be controversial. And that puts us at a disadvantage. Right. And the question, of course, is how do we ameliorate that situation? And I think that's an important issue in the current discussion in the presidential race, as well as what do we do about individual tax rates?
Right, indeed. In fact, just this past week, during the presidential debate that took place in New York, it was interesting to note that Governor Romney talked about the corporate tax rate, as you have just done, and communicating that in Canada, just across the border, we're looking at a corporate tax rate of 15%. And in our country, we've got over 35%. And so, would a business leader, an entrepreneur, feel the incentive or realize the incentive of investing in the U.S. economy? Or will he go elsewhere? And we've seen tax rates around the world actually reduced at significant rates. In fact, Sweden just reduced its high tax rate gradually, but now it's going to be in the lower 20s. And in fact, the EU average tax rate has for corporate taxes is just in the low 20s as well.
Yeah, one of the problems in the United States, and perhaps it's because we're so big, is we think that we're an island unto ourselves and that we don't have to worry about the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But as you pointed out, there has been a movement in the last 10 years towards lower and lower tax rates. There's tax competition going on. And certainly within the newly emerging Eastern European countries, these tax rates have gone as low as 9%. But that isn't all of the problem. Another problem is that almost all countries tax on the basis of earnings within the country. Mm-hmm. So if you're Procter & Gamble and you earn money within the country, you're taxed only on your earnings in that country. The United States, however, takes a much broader view on taxation. It will tax Procter & Gamble on its earnings anywhere in the world. And of course, the foreign earnings are taxed when they're brought back into the United States. Mm-hmm. So that presents a tremendous incentive for corporations not to repatriate all their earnings. And that has effect on our capital markets and makes it harder to find funds for investment.
The tax reform that is being discussed by both presidential candidate and the current president, it takes into account also the balancing of budget eventually. Governor Romney is putting more emphasis on balancing the budget. Why do you think the growth is not taken into account? Obviously, Laffer curve put into consideration high tax revenue with lower tax rates, but we also need to take into account higher growth that comes with lower taxation, and also a possibility to balance the budget in a 4-year term, perhaps like Canada did. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, when tax proposals are made in the United States, in Congress, the arbiter of what is the impact is the Congressional Budget Office. And unfortunately, the Congressional Budget Office is not allowed to take into account any potential growth effects that a cut in tax rates would create. Let me just say at this point, when you use the word taxes, I do not know what that means. Mm-hmm. There are tax rates, mm-hmm. and there are tax revenues. So when someone says they want to increase taxes, are they talking about increasing tax rates, mm-hmm. or are they talking about increasing tax revenues? Mm-hmm. The problem with increasing tax rates is you affect individual incentives. It creates inefficiencies within the economy because now some parts of the economy are taxed higher relative to other parts. And you use more of the parts that are taxed at a lower rate and less of the parts that are taxed at a higher rate, which may or may not be the best way to use our resources. As far as tax revenue, this is where the Laffer curve comes in. It's unclear that higher tax rates lead to higher tax revenues. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if your tax rate is 1 or 2% and you raise your tax rate to 5 or 7%, you'll probably get more tax revenues. But when your tax rates are 35% and you want to raise them to over 40%, then it's very doubtful that you will get tax revenues, additional tax revenues. And we've had examples of this, when the tax rates were cut back in 1978, and suddenly the U.S. government found there was a huge windfall of tax revenues. That's a good example of how cutting tax rates can actually lead to greater tax revenues.
In fact, Dr. Miles says you have just mentioned about how Eastern Europe had a number of post-communist Eastern European countries reduce their tax rates and broaden their tax base. In fact, you have met and worked with a number of Eastern European leaders as well during your career. And I recall Marc Laffer from Estonia, a pioneer of tax reform and actually free market reforms in Eastern Europe, who mentioned at numerous occasions of how his country had a problem whenever they reduced tax rates. They had far more tax revenue. And it's basically proven through empirical evidences in a number of these Eastern European countries. And as we look at what's going on in, for example, in Asia with China and India, both of these countries are benefiting from certain gateways of investments. For example, Hong Kong for China at a low 16.7 tax rate that they have for corporations, and Mauritius, which has also now applied a flat tax rate, which is a low flat tax of 15%. So with Asia and its emerging tigers out there and Eastern Europe's post-communist economies looking at lowering tax rates, when you mentioned in defining it, it is unfortunate that American taxpayers are still burdened by higher tax rates.
Well, I always think of economics as being about incentives. And if you would like to understand what is going to happen, you should follow the incentives. And unfortunately, the economic approach from the 20th century got away from looking at incentives. All it did is look at what are the overall aggregate demand effects. And that's missing an important part of economic theory. What we're talking about right now are the incentive effects. The more you tax an activity, the less of it you get. The more you subsidize an activity, the more of it you get. Politicians forget that higher tax rates lead to less economic activity.
When you be taking into consideration all the loopholes, exemptions, and special taxation, lower taxation for certain activities, that actually additionally reduces tax revenue. Is Laffer curve taking some of that into consideration, or that's actually a side effect?
That's a different effect because it's not a marginal effect. It's what we would call an inframarginal effect. On the margin, it isn't affected by individual choices the same way. In fact, this goes more back to the concept of a single tax. You know, a block tax, everybody pays the same tax rate. There are no incentive effects. And the way to maximize tax rates or tax revenues is really, as Joel, you were saying, to lower tax rates, encourage more economic activity to be within the economy, and for more people who are investing to invest in taxable activities and therefore broaden the tax base and end up with more revenue. And on top of that, if you eliminate some of these tax deductions, you end up with even more tax revenue. I'm always amazed that in Washington, that on the one hand, politicians will rail against tax loopholes, and then they will turn around and talk about, well, my plan is to have targeted tax cuts.
Right.
You know, to keep companies from going overseas or punish companies who do this or do that, which is just another way of saying, I'm going to create more tax loopholes.
And Dr. Miles, as we look at the U.S. economy, in fact, we look at our U.S. debt. There is a recent report from Bloomberg written by Tracy Withers, who states, I quote, "The Congressional Budget Office has warned the U.S. economy will fall into recession if $600 billion of government spending cuts and tax increases take place at the start of 2013. Financial markets are complacent about whether the White House and Congress will reach an agreement on deferring the so-called fiscal drag on the economy until later next year, unquote. Could you elaborate on this particular issue, on the concerns about the U.S. economy falling into another recession and the issues of our significant debt?
One of the problems over the last 4 years has been uncertainty. People don't know what policies are going to be in place. I strongly believe in what I like to call TLC policies: transparent, long-term oriented, and credible.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
And what has been proposed over the last 4 years has been mostly short-term oriented, not so clear what it involves, and questionable as to whether it'll work. And to get the economy moving, to get the economy out of the funk we are in, there needs to be some major change in our approach to policy. We have to stop nibbling around the edges and do some major tax and entitlement changes. Now, the Simpson-Bowles Committee had some interesting ideas. And if I were to point to one of the major failings of the Obama administration, it was not promoting Simpson-Bowles. And I think you'll find a lot of Republicans and Democrats who feel the same way. So here we are, coming to the end of 2012. We haven't resolved these long-term problems, still nibbling around the edges, still threatening, talking about Bush tax cuts from the early 2000s. It's the same stuff over and over and over. Nobody's talking about transparent, long-term oriented, credible policies. And I think until we adopt something along the lines of a Simpson-Bowles, where we have a major tax reform for corporations, again, lowering the tax rate to a competitive level in the world, reducing some of the tax deductions that go along with it, and doing something about the way we punish corporations if they try to bring their capital back into the United States. That will go a long way. We have to do the same thing for individuals. This is not a new argument. We need to lower tax rates for individuals just as it's occurring throughout the world, and reduce deductions. Unfortunately, in this particular campaign, there seems to be a lot of what I would call economic class warfare, or populism, where those who have high incomes are made out to be pikers, so to speak, not paying their fair share, whereas, in fact, the overwhelming amount of tax revenue comes from these individuals. We all know that close to 50% of people do not pay income tax. They're already getting the maximum tax cut. They're not paying any. Mm-hmm. So, of course, if we lower tax rates, it's only going to be those who are paying taxes who will get any benefits from that. And we have to get off of the idea that, oh my gosh, we don't want to give any break to people who are already paying taxes. My feeling is, should we get to the cliff and the Bush tax cuts actually expire, I'm not terribly upset about that. Let's stop talking about the Bush tax cuts. Let's move on to the future, not talk about the past. Let's talk about major tax reform. Mm-hmm. And I sense there's more and more movement within Washington in this direction. A lot of people are gloomy about the United States economy, and there are certainly reasons to feel that way. But if you look at history, the United States has a history of adjusting much more quickly to changing events and changing environments than other countries. I have some hope about the United States because just like markets adjust, political markets adjust. And I would suspect that in the next couple of years, and maybe within the next 6 months or so, there could be a major shift in the emphasis on taxes and spending.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.